Hi, this is Kendra from Pencil and Pigment, and today I wanted to talk about paper preference as it directly relates and correlates to weight. Now, I see a lot of artists and creators and hobbyists sort of questioning the same things over and over, so I thought I would make a video, and if this helps you, I'm so glad. So, in the United States, we use the Imperial measurement system. We are not the only one in the world. Liberia does, and Myanmar or Burma, they also use Imperial. But the rest of the world is on the metric system. Now, where we start to have an issue is with paper and weight, pound versus grams, and you'll see that on the paper. LB is the pound symbol and GSM is the grams per square meter. Basically, when it comes to paper weight, it's only done two ways. There's the international paper weight system and the North American system, which is called the basis weight system. Now stick with me because this is going to get a little confusing. Grams, the GSM for paperweight, is determined one way. They will run off a piece of paper, they will cut a sample sheet size in 1 square meter, and whatever that weight is becomes the weight of the paper. Now the paper may be cut down to smaller sheets, and may be cut down to standard letter size or index card size or whatever it's cut down to. But at 1 square meter sample size, that is how they determine the GSM and the weight of the paper, which is pretty universal and standard and makes it really easy to determine what weighs more and what doesn't. Where there becomes an issue is with the pound. So a lot of art sketchbooks, drawing books, watercolor books, a lot of things are made in the United States, and a lot of books have the pound listed first. And if you live in the US, you're used to using, the imperial system over the metric, and it's not our default to use the metric. And right now I'm going to tell you, this is why you want to switch over to using metric when it comes to paper weights. Because how paper weight is determined by pound is very different. So when they go to determine paper weight by pound, they put it in a 500 sheet stack. That's called a ream. I've also heard it called to like the master sheet size or the basis size. So 500 sheets of this page together determines the pound weight. Where we run into problems, and this is where I see artists online when they go to review different papers and different sketchbooks and stuff saying, I'm not sure why this one seems a little bit thinner or thicker than the other one of the same weight. I'm not sure why that is because the size of the sheet used for that stack of 500 to make that ream, to make that master, could be a different size. I'll keep going. I'll explain it in depth, but I'll keep going. So different papers use a different size sheet, and then they stack them in piles of 500 and determine pound. So cover stock, which is like office paper, they use a different size sheet of paper when they weigh the 500 for the ream. Index stock, which is index cards, uses a different size for their 500 sheet ream. Bristol stock, which is like Bristol board, it's our art, a lot of art paper is made out of Bristol. That's a different size sheet that they use when they stack it in 500 to determine the weight. Tag stock, which is like tags for clothing, that's a different size. Textbook or text paper, which is book paper, sometimes it's called offset or coated paper. This paper, which is what you do books on, where it's printed on both sides, it has a very different texture than the cover stock. That is a completely different size paper that they use when they stack it in 500 for the ream, for the master, to determine the weight. So you can very well have something that, like 80-pound text paper, that weighs more than 80-pound cover stock paper. Because 80-pound text paper is 104 grams, and 80-pound cover stock paper is 218 grams, because they used a different size sheet when they stacked it in 500 to determine the weight. So determining weight by pound is not accurate. So when I tell people that 300 grams, the GSM of watercolor paper, if you really like wet on wet, if you like the standard weight watercolor paper, it should always be 300 grams. And if I tell them, hey, 300 grams always equals 140 pounds, but 140 pounds does not always equal 300 grams. So if everywhere else in the world is making 300 gram watercolor paper, you know that's going to be 140 pounds. But if the United States is making 140 pound watercolor paper, it may not be 300 grams, depending on the size of the paper they use for the 500 stack for the ream, or the master. A lot of people refer to it as the master. I don't like that word. It's used in photography as well. It's not my favorite. For example, if you look at Moleskine, is a very popular sketchbook art supply company, and you look at the Moleskine art sketchbook, that's 111 pounds. So that's 165 grams. And you're thinking, oh, okay, well, they make a craft paper cover sketchbook that's a little bit more budget, but that's only 120 grams. Now their Moleskine art watercolor album, if you've ever purchased one of those, you're like, yeah, it's fine, but it doesn't perform the same as their watercolor block. And I'm going to tell you why, because the art watercolor album made by Moleskine is 200 grams. And you're like, no, I looked at it, it's only 135 pounds. And their block's only 140 pounds. That's a 5-pound difference. No, look at the grams. The Moleskine art watercolor album is 200 grams, and the Moleskine watercolor block is 300 grams. That's a 100-gram difference. You want to start switching over to grams for consistency. So think about your favorite sketchbook, drawing book, watercolor book. Think about your favorite papers and start looking at the grams. And if you think, oh, this is the perfect weight or this is a hair too thin, never go below that gram weight. Just stick to that size measurement. It's universal and it works for absolutely everything. If you're purchasing a sketchbook from Etsy and they don't list the grams, I would say skip it, because you don't know what the pound means. You're not sure what size paper they use to make that ream. So I would ask, you can ask sellers on Amazon, you can ask sellers on Etsy, you can ask questions of every company like, hey, what's the gram weight for this paper? And figure out what you like and don't like and what can handle your art style and your mediums without falling apart and doing all the things you want it to do. I hope this helped. I hope this wasn't too confusing. But I see professional artists on here that they're like, I don't understand. I purchased this, it said 140 pounds, and I purchased this one and it said 140 pounds. But this one, when I go to watercolor on it, it curls, it buckles, it can't handle my wet on wet. Well, that's because the gram's probably different. It's not 300 grams. And personally, I prefer 300 gram paper for watercolor. I think that's sort of one of the sketchbooks you don't want to compromise on, just because it involves water. So maybe a sketchbook with a lighter weight, if you really, really love it, you just do colored pencil instead of ink. Like, those things can be sort of rearranged and negotiated. But I feel like with watercolor, it's a whole different game, and that's kind of hard to change up. I mean, that's not to say you can't gesso a page and try and lay something down on thinner paper if you're doing acrylic or something. You can definitely try different stuff. But I really, really want to encourage you, especially if you're on a budget and you only have enough money to buy one sketchbook, and you've got to make it a good one, and you want it to handle a certain ink or a certain process you go about with layering, start looking at the grams. Just don't even bother with the pounds. It's an inconsistent system that's really hard to memorize, and unless you're in the printing industry in the US, it's really hard to remember what is what for every standard of what size is used for when they cut the 500 ream. It's just too much information. So I hope this video helped. I hoped it wasn't too confusing. I hope the next time you make a purchase that you look at the grams and start looking at some of your favorite books and figuring out what you enjoy. I'm going to be doing another video that talks about paper ingredients and surfaces, because that also can affect your process and what you're working on. So yeah, I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and I will talk to you all tomorrow.